There is no greater power than the power of people working together. Through the ages, many significant reforms and life-saving regulations have been gained for the working class people through unionizing, organizing, and worker solidarity. Looking back at one of the first times common laborers came together in a strike, the stakes were higher than just low pay. Along with horrendous working conditions, these particular factory workers were forced to fight for their lives as a terrifying ailment began making its way through their workplace. When an activist arrived at this 19th century East London matchstick factory, the story she recounted from these factory workers would ignite a metaphorical spark of defiance that would spread into a blazing outcry across the UK and empower future generations of workers to do the same. London's East End neighborhood became a hub for immigration and a variety of cultures through the centuries. In the 17th century, French Protestants began to settle in the neighborhood, followed by Ashkenazi Jews in the early 18th century. In the 19th century, the East End was home to growing populations of Africans, Asians, Irish, Afro-Caribbean, and Eastern European Jewish people. There's no question that life was notoriously difficult for these marginalized populations, and the neighborhood became known for extreme poverty, overpopulation, disease, and starvation. The infamous Jack the Ripper began victimizing this very neighborhood towards the end of the century. But the stigmatization of the East End by the rest of London was likely the cause for much of its bad reputation, along with its socio-economic troubles. Much of mainstream English society held xenophobic views, and some Londoners viewed the East End as though it were a foreign country rather than a neighborhood in their own city. A great deal of the written history of the East End was penned from an outsider's perspective, and the conditions were often exaggerated and sensationalized. The East End was sometimes literally referred to as outcast London, and individuals from around Britain would travel to the neighborhood to gawk at its residents, an activity known as slumming. As a result of this prejudice, those from the East End who were lucky enough to find a steady job as unskilled laborers were often forced to settle for low pay, long hours, and poor working conditions. Many immigrant workers from the East End ended up in factories. These workers were made up of all demographics: men, women, and children. The population of immigrant women were especially impacted by this line of work, and despite the dimly lit, crowded, and unsafe conditions, children were considered acceptable and capable for the duties required. In 1833, Parliament enacted legislation that was supposed to limit the amount of time children could spend working in factories. The Factory Act of 1833 disallowed children under the age of 9 to work at all, and it called for children ages 9 through 13 to work no more than 48 hours a week, 8 hours a day. But due to the small size of the inspection team that was meant to enforce the act, most factories were able to evade the restrictions, and the fact that very few labor unions existed at the time allowed many factories to be dangerously unregulated. The deplorable wages and crushing economic struggles of these immigrant families forced a steady stream of women laborers into London's sweated industries. One of these many industries was the Bryant and May Match Factory, established in 1861. The first friction matches were sold in 1827, after chemist John Walker invented them by accident. He called them friction lights and used a potassium chloride antimony sulfide paste at the end of each matchstick that would ignite when struck against sandpaper. By 1831, white phosphorus, then known as yellow phosphorus, was added to the matches. This increased their popularity since it made them easier to light. But even then, white phosphorus was known to be a potentially dangerous substance. In previous centuries, it was used as a deadly poison, although its glow-in-the-dark properties made it easy to detect the cause of death. Despite this, the demand for matches grew, and they became one of the largest products to use white phosphorus. During the 1840s, red phosphorus was discovered to be an effective, non-toxic replacement, but many match factories didn't bother to make the switch. In fact, by the late 1800s, only 2 of the 25 match factories across England used red phosphorus instead of white. The Bryant and May factory was among these 23 establishments, and their indifference to employee safety would have dire consequences. Most of the workers at Bryant and May were made up of the immigrant women and girls of the East End neighborhood. Many of these workers were new or early generation Irish immigrants, some as young as 13 years old. These young women and girls were faced with atrocious conditions at work. For 14 hours a day, workers would work in various stages of production, including dipping small pieces of poplar or pine wood into the toxic white phosphorus chemical mixture to form the head of the match, placing each of them out to dry and boxing them up for retail. They were expected to remain standing for the duration of their shift, not permitted to leave their workstation for lunch, and were scheduled only 2 bathroom breaks. They were responsible for keeping their workstation clean and well-stocked, and had to purchase their own tools and brushes. Additionally, workers faced a number of fines for ridiculous and humiliating stipulations, such as talking or using the bathroom outside of scheduled breaks. Fines would also be issued for having a messy workstation, dropping a match, arriving late, and dirty feet, which singled out the workers who couldn't afford shoes and were forced to work barefoot. Workers were even subject to physical abuse by the foreman in charge and were told, "Never mind your fingers," when working with machinery. This degrading treatment alone was enough to make life miserable, but the exposure to hazardous chemicals in the match heads brought on injuries so horrific the women had no choice but to risk their meager wages and organize to save their lives. The fumes from the white phosphorus that were inhaled at the match factories could cause a terrible condition known as phossy jaw, occurring usually between 3 and 5 years of continued exposure. The first symptom would come in the form of pain and swelling in the jawbone, or toothaches. As the condition progressed, a pus with a foul odor would develop inside the victim's mouth, which quickly led to necrosis, the advanced stage of the condition in which the victim's jawbone would decay and rot away. The condition would be potentially fatal if the infection spread to the brain, so doctors would often need to surgically remove the jawbone completely. It became such a common occurrence that the factory would have the affected teeth of the worker removed at the first complaint of pain. If the worker refused to have their teeth pulled, they were fired. While their workers continued to suffer under these oppressive and dangerous conditions, the shareholders of Bryant and May enjoyed dividends of over 20%, and the factory management continued to extract as much labor from their workers as they could in order to keep these shareholders happy. The factory expanded to approximately 1,400 workers and continued to push them to the breaking point until a women's rights campaigner came to visit them in 1888. Annie Besant was an important figure of social reform in 19th century London, and she hoped to expose the terrible aspects of factory work and initiate a push to improve the lives of working women. She began interviewing the factory workers directly to get first-hand information about their working conditions. She took down lengthy descriptions of the many ridiculous fines they faced, their poor pay, and the terrible conditions they faced daily, and published it all as an expose in a newspaper called The Link. As the story circulated, it horrified and informed readers, leading to public awareness, sympathy, and most importantly, support. Factory management was furious about the story and soon retaliated, firing the women they believed had spoken to Besant. They pushed back harder by trying to force workers to sign a statement which contradicted the article, stating that it was false and that they were happy with their working conditions. This further angered workers, and when one worker was fired for refusing to sign the document, a strike was finally set in motion. On July 5th, 200 of the workers left the factory and marched to the Link's offices on Fleet Street to further air their grievances to the press. Soon after, all 1,400 workers would follow suit and walk out from Bryant and May. They marched through the streets and told their stories, which gripped the media and the public. 50 of these women even appeared at Parliament to plead their cases. This visit left a lasting impression of the extreme poverty of the workers, which starkly contrasted with the wealthy members of Parliament and some of the upper-class Londoners observing from the outside. The support for these young women and girls grew, and donations were pulled together for a much-needed strike fund. Besant continued to provide support, helping to organize the Union of Women Matchmakers Labor Union, one of the first of its kind. The women continued to support each other through the strike, and their solidarity grew. Finally, a few weeks later on July 21st, 1888, Bryant and May gave in to the striking workers, ending their oppressive fines altogether and allowing back the workers who had been fired. Management also agreed to give the workers a breakfast room, so they no longer had to be confined to their workspace during their allotted meal, allowing them to eat away from the dangerous white phosphorus. While this was a small victory, it was significant to workers' rights overall, as it brought important awareness of deplorable factory conditions for the first time and demonstrated that even the unskilled workers of the East End could flex collective bargaining power on powerful factory bosses. The strike inspired many other working-class people to follow in their footsteps in the months and years that followed, and resulted in a labor movement known as New Unionism. More than anything, the Match Girl strike proved the power of worker solidarity and resilience to many for the first time. Unfortunately, Bryant and May continued using white phosphorus in their matchsticks for another 13 years, although there was continued pushback. In 1891, the Salvation Army opened their own match factory that provided fair wages and made matchsticks without the toxic element. But the Salvation Army wasn't able to compete with the sweat industry factories for long, with the added cost of better and safer practices. Finally, in 1901, as the tide continued to turn, Bryant and May finally omitted white phosphorus from their matchstick production process, and the element was banned from use in factories soon after. The factory remained in operation until 1979, when the company moved to Liverpool. The factory building was eventually transformed into flats and still stands today. The front of the building exhibits a blue plaque that commemorates Annie Besant's work and the brave and resilient match girls of the East End.